Greetings, and thank you for your interest in my book, which is about an Afro-Caribbean in the Nazi era. The Afro-Caribbean is the gentleman in this picture. His name was Lionel Romney, and he was my father. My name is Mary Romney Shaw. In this presentation, I'm going to be talking about where and when my father lived. Then I'll outline my father's World War II experience, followed by some brief background on the Nazi era and Mauthausen, which was the concentration camp where he was imprisoned. And then, in his own words, you will hear him talking about his experience at Mauthausen. I'll say a word about his survival. I'll discuss trauma and healing, and I will conclude with why I wrote my book about my father's wartime experience. So again, this was my father's name, Lionel Romney. This is when he lived and his life in geographical terms. Rather than explain it all, I'll just say that number 1 is meant to represent the Dutch side of the Caribbean island of St. Martin, which is where my father was from. And number 2 is meant to represent Aruba, Curacao, and Venezuela, which are 3 more places where my father lived in his pre-war life. The oral history that I recorded with my father was the source of the information in my book. Now I'm going to outline his World War II experience as he told it to me in his oral history. Now, as a civilian, he was a sailor on cargo ships sailing between the Caribbean, North America, and Europe from the mid-1930s to 1940. And in June 1940, he was aboard the SS Makis, which was a Greek merchant ship sailing through the Mediterranean on its way to Greece. That ship was mined. As you know, a mine is an explosive device, and it sank. But the crew was rescued by a ship from the Italian Navy. My father's ship was somewhere in these waters when it struck the mine, and the Italian Navy ship rescued them. So that was how my father became a political prisoner in Italy. So for the next 4 years, he was transferred through a series of internment camps in Italy until 1944, when he was deported from this area of Italy to the Mauthausen concentration camp in Austria, which is right about there. And he remained a prisoner in that camp until it was liberated by the US Army at the end of the war. Being taken to Mauthausen put him squarely in the hands of the Nazis. So I'd like to say a word about Mauthausen within the context of the concentration camp system. As you know, there were different kinds of concentration camps. There were death camps, also known as extermination camps. There were labor camps. There were prison camps. There were women's camps. There were transit camps. However, Mauthausen was unique. It was the only camp that was specifically designated to work its prisoners to death. It was the only so-called death through work camp. About 200,000 people were imprisoned there over the life of the camp. And these included people from all of the groups that the Nazis specifically targeted for extermination. And those were Jews, Roma and Sinti, Slavic peoples, the handicapped, criminals, Jehovah's Witnesses, communists, political opponents, and LGBTQ. So the prisoner population at Mauthausen was very diverse, with every country in Europe being represented and every continent as well. About 90,000 people were worked to death, tortured to death, starved to death, and died in other ways. My father witnessed the destruction of human life every day that he was at Mauthausen, which was almost a year. He was always wondering if he would be the next one to die. The result was that he was deeply traumatized by his experience there, so much so that he was virtually silent about it for over 40 years. but in 1989, he opened up and began to talk about it. I never thought he would because it had taken me over 20 years to get him to talk about it. So I want to play a few minutes of our very first conversation about his internment at Mauthausen. This is from the very first oral history interview we ever had together. This excerpt is a bit less than 3 minutes.
And so then, after the war, where were you when the war ended?
I was in the camp in Austria.
In Austria, not in Germany.
No, in Germany, in Austria.
In
we
Austria.
came in from Italy. They took us to Austria.
By train.
Yeah, cattle. What the hell you call it?
A cattle car.
Yeah, cattle car.
Yeah.
Everybody, what a bundle in there.
And where in Austria?
It was up in the place, is near to Graz. That's in a concentration camp, one of those notorious concentration camps. Mauthausen. It's up on the hill. They had the crematorium and the camps, you know. The barracks like thing, you know, had so many people in the barracks. So we were liberated in 1945, the 10th of May.
10th of May.
1945. About a couple of days before Hitler died.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Huh. Oh, that's interesting.
We were liberated by the Fifth Army, the American Fifth Army.
A couple of days after what?
A couple of days before Hitler died.
Did you ever have any close calls?
Were you ever in, what kind of danger would you say you were in during that time?
Oh, every day was dangerous. There wasn't a day that wasn't, considered. Sometimes you said, so how the hell they going to get out of here? And then we heard some of the, different things from the atrocities of the Germans was committing in the camps. Like before they leave, they kill everybody.
Right.
See if they have to run away. But we were up close to the place in Austria where we were. It was close to the Czechoslovakian border.
Uh-huh.
You can hear the Russian cannonading. And you can hear the concussion from the artillery,
Oh, yeah.
But how did you survive? This was one of the first questions I asked my father when he talked about his experience. He never answered this question, but I know that there were a few reasons why he survived. Perhaps the main reason for his survival was his knowledge of languages. Prisoners with language skills were often allowed to live longer than others because they could serve as interpreters. So my father knew all of these languages. Papiamentu is a Caribbean language. There were a lot of prisoners at Mauthausen who spoke all of these European languages, so he was able to communicate with a lot of people. One of his nicknames was the translator. The subtitle of my book, which is From Papiamentu to German, is meant to pay tribute to the role of languages in my father's survival. Even though he survived, my father was deeply traumatized. However, oral history may have played a part in helping him to heal. So I'd like to read a passage from my book that addresses the healing power of speaking about trauma. In the absence of words, the survivor perpetually endures past trauma as present experience. But words allow him to relegate the past to its proper place. Words bring him to a safe space. And I think that's what happened to my father during our oral history interviews. In the same way that oral history was healing for my father my experience visiting Mauthausen in 2006 and then writing the book brought peace to me. So again, reading from my book, visiting Mauthausen finally brought me to a place of peace with my father's experience there. I have never seen my father as a World War II hero, but rather as a victor. Although he was a victim of the Nazis, he was also a victor. His victory was in his survival. Knowing this, I can gratefully be at peace. I wrote this book about my father's experience for a few reasons. Among them are that I wanted to weave another thread into the tapestry of African diaspora history in order to help complete the picture, because so much of it is missing. We, as African diaspora people, have to take control of and responsibility for our own narrative. It is because others have appropriated our narrative for so many centuries that we have not been in control of it, and oral history helps us take that control. Also, I wanted my book to be an example of how everyone has participated in or been a witness to historical events. And I wanted my book to serve as an example to others and encourage them to pursue oral histories with their families. So in closing, I would just like to say that my father's oral history is the basis of my book about his World War II experience and my visits to Mauthausen. My father's experience is an example of a story that only came to light because of oral history. I hope that my experience with oral history will encourage you and others to embark on oral history projects with your families and members of your communities. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon. My name is Ronald Daniels. My author's name is R.E. Vincent Daniels. I have written 3 books, which is a trilogy, as a result of my experience, life experience as an African American here in the United States. My background academically is in the STEM field. Professionally, I'm an engineer. But my hobby is historical research in the area of STEM, science, technology, and engineering. And it's been a hobby for me since probably the third grade, as in reference to African American history and participation on the world stage as well as here in the United States. And how I got to be that way is that, to make a story short, in the third grade, I was able to integrate a school in Brooklyn, New York. And what that turned out to be is that experience was that I learned that history of African people in general was not part of the overall curriculum or syllabus. As such, many of the students, one particular student who was one of my best friends turned out to be, was unaware of our contributions, whether it be in America or whether it be on the world stage. And so he told me, he said, your people never did anything in history. And so as a result, I went to my parents, Philip and Edna Vincent Daniels, and they informed me, particularly my father, that that was not true. And I learned to research history on people like Benjamin Banneker and Crispus Attucks, people of that nature, who helped make this country what it is. And so fast forward some many years later, I got the same response from people who were as educated, if not more so, in terms of believing the same thing. They believe that people of African descent did not contribute at all to the overall experience of America and its greatness. And so what we did was I determined I needed to play my part and try to set the record straight. And as a result, I created 3 books. And the first book was See Us, From Whence We Come. Second book was Truth Awakens, Daring to Dream of Past History in order to envision future glory. And the last book would be Igniting the Fire, brings the light from invisibility to academic viability and excellence. And so a follow-up to that, it turned out to be that I follow the African tradition of Sankofa. And so Sankofa, for those who don't know, you look back on history in order to know where you're going in the future. And I determined that we need to claim our self-identity and history. And by doing so, we need to share that with people who are not familiar with our history and to explain that to them, because they were, for whatever reason, denied that availability of history. And so this is what the book's all about, to imply information to the general public, and particularly to people of color and those of African descent from the diaspora. And I follow what is part of the African tradition from the great historian, great genius, the world's first great genius, Imhotep. Imhotep said, man, know thyself, and that includes women as well. So we must know ourselves in order to be part of the big picture. So moving forward, we're not trying to force our history onto other people, but just to let them know we are part of humanity and we help create what is now the history of this world. And so moving forward, I want people of color to take this information once they learn it, if they don't have it already embedded in their DNA, to now be able to explain that to other people, so we can take our rightful place in the historical archives of mankind. And so we're now under a situation whereby they're trying to destroy our history, rewrite history, take away rights for people of color, and particularly people of African descent. And so these books, which first came out in 2020, and the last book, which I'm referring to, is 90 Fire Brings to Light, came out this year in 2023. So with this information, hopefully we can move forward. We can stand proud of ourselves and what we contribute as people, men and women, African men and women over the diaspora. And I really feel that we can't start our history in the United States, or even in the Caribbean, or even in South America. Our history started in Africa. That's our homeland, and we should be proud of that. In fact, it was the Greeks and Romans that went to Africa, spent 20 years or so learning what Africans learned. And they built on that, and they tried to appropriate our history and make it theirs, and we cannot let that happen. So I say this: we can't forget where we come from and who we are, and we must know that. And the people who mentored me, or people like Dr. Ben, Dr. Ivan Versertima, and John Henry Clark, those are people who mentored my thoughts and my ability to think of history. So I hopefully pass that torch on to young people and old people, so we can take our place in history as everyone else has, and not be ashamed of it. So we must stay awake, okay? We must always be awake and let people know what the great African general said. Where there's no way, you have to make a way. And that was the African general Hannibal Barca, or Carthage. So I want to end there. I appreciate my time and encourage those to read the trilogy and read it in order. See Us, Truth Awakens, and Night to Fire Brings the Light. Those are the three, and you have to read them in order, put everything in context, and hopefully it'll make a difference in making this world a better place. And here I like to end my presentation. And I appreciate your time with me, and God bless. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Joyce Mosley, and I am the author of Graham's Gift. For over 20 years, I have researched my family history, and I wanted to share this history with the children of my family, but also with, since this information is not taught in schools or included in textbooks, I think it's important that children know the contributions that African Americans made to the history of this country. My goal is to ensure that all children know their African ancestors played a significant role in the history of America and locally in Pennsylvania. African American history is not a separate history, it is American history. The story, Graham's Gift, is about the contributions made to a nation's history by a family with African, European, and Native American roots living in Philadelphia as free people during slavery. The grandmother begins the lesson with Cyrus Bustle, who was born enslaved in Burlington, New Jersey, February 2nd, 1732. He was a mulatto. His father was European, a lawyer in the colony, New Jersey, and an enslaver. His mother was an enslaved woman owned by the Bustle family. Both Cyrus and his mother were the property of Cyrus's grandfather, Samuel Bustle Sr., and their names are recorded in his will. Cyrus's father, Samuel Bustle Jr., was a leader in his community, a Quaker, and a slave owner. When Cyrus was 10 years old, his grandfather died and he was sold to Judge John Allen and went to live on the judge's land away from his family. The judge promised Cyrus his freedom for being a faithful worker, but Allen died before granting Cyrus his freedom. So, at the age of 30, Cyrus was sold to a second Quaker named Thomas Pryor. While the property of Pryor, Cyrus learned a trade. He learned to bake. He hired a boy to teach him to read and write. And while the bread was baking, he would learn to read and write, and at night he would read by candlelight. In 1768, he was manumitted. He opened a successful bakery and ran that for several years in the town of Burlington. During the Revolutionary War, the winter of 1777-1778, Cyrus was commissioned to bake bread and deliver it to George Washington's troops camped at Valley Forge for the winter. After the war, Cyrus moved his family to Philadelphia and became a leader in the Black community while operating a bakery in South Philadelphia. The blue marker you see on this page is a historic marker by the Pennsylvania Historic Society, and it is located in front of the bakery shop that Cyrus operated for many years. Cyrus was also a leader in his community. He was one of the founding members of the Free African Society, along with Richard Allen and Absalom Jones. This organization provided assistance for enslaved people on the run, and he supported several Black churches, the early churches that were part of the diasporas in Philadelphia. In 1806, he retired and opened a school in his home for free and enslaved children. He died 1806. He married Elizabeth Moray, born free in 1742. She also had a European father, and her mother was Native American and African. Elizabeth's grandfather, Humphrey Moray, arrived in Oyster Bay, New York, and moved to Philadelphia somewhere around the 1680s. He was the first mayor of Philadelphia appointed by William Penn in 1691. Humphrey purchased over 700 acres of land from William Penn in Philadelphia and what is now Glenside, Pennsylvania. He owned enslaved people. He was a slaver and a Quaker, which most people don't know that Quakers did own slaves. William Penn, Benjamin Franklin, just to name two. Humphrey's son Richard manumitted his slaves after the death of his father. And because Elizabeth's mother was a free woman, Elizabeth was born free. Richard and Cremona had a 10-year relationship, living as a married couple, and had 5 children. When Richard died, he willed to Cremona 198 acres of land in what is now Glenside, Pennsylvania. Several years after Richard died, Cremona remarried a man of African descent, and they had 1 child. Cremona died without a will, which was very common for women at that time. And the Moray land, which passed to John Fry, her husband, but the Moray children wanted their father's land, and they took John Fry to court, and the family land was divided into parcels so that the children had land, and John Fry lived on the land until his death. Elizabeth was Richard and Cremona's middle child. She married Cyrus Bustill August 20th, 1773 at Christ Church in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. They had 8 children that they raised Quaker. The family lived in Burlington, New Jersey during the Revolutionary War, but relocated to Philadelphia at the end of the war. Cyrus was very active in his community, and his children were also very active. They were teachers and activists and abolitionists and agents on the Underground Railroad, business owners, artists, ministers, school principals, suffragettes, and they raised money for many worthwhile organizations. They started schools for children of color, helped freedom seekers get to freedom by providing transportation, shelter, raising money to purchase food and clothing for the enslaved people on the run. I'm going to talk just a few minutes about some of the 8 children that Cyrus and Elizabeth had and the contributions they made. This is the story that the grandmother told her grandchildren. The youngest child of the Bustills, Grace, married Robert Douglas, minister of the First African Episcopal Church. She remained a Quaker and an activist all her life. She was a businesswoman. She owned a millinery shop next to her father's bakery. She made hats for Quaker women. Grace and her husband were activists, abolitionists, suffragettes, agents on the Underground Railroad, and led in the community of free Blacks. One of the portraits that Robert Douglas Jr. portraits was James Forten. James Forten was one of the wealthiest men of color in Philadelphia in 1830s. Grace's daughter, Sarah Mapps, was an artist, and here's an example of her work. Another example of her work. And the originals for these drawings, paintings, are at the Philadelphia Historic Society. Another one of the Bustill children was David. David Bustill was an agent in the Underground Railroad, and his house served as a stop for the Underground Railroad. His son, David Busto Bowser, was a artist, was one of the first people of color to be a successful artist. He showed remarkable talent at a young age and was tutored by his older cousin, Robert Douglas. David Busto Bowser painted portraits of President Abraham Lincoln and John Brown. He also painted 13 of the Civil War regimental troop flags. And these are two of the portraits he painted. And the painting of John Brown was actually painted in David Busto Bowser's home. Philadelphia was the first city to have a volunteer fire company, and to distinguish against the different companies, they commissioned hats. And this is a sample of one of the hats that David Busto Bowser painted. And this is the 127th United States Color Troop Reginald flag that is the only one of the 13 left currently hanging in the Philadelphia Museum of the American Civil War. David had 3 sons. They were all very active in the Underground Railroad. He had one of his sons, Charles, had 2 daughters, Maria Louisa Busto, who married Reverend William Robeson and is Paul Robeson's mother, Gertrude Busto, who was a teacher, a writer. She married Dr. Nathan Moselle, who was the founder of the African American Hospital, Frederick Douglass Hospital, the first hospital in Philadelphia for people of color. Just a quick note, Paul Robeson was a Renaissance man, and he influenced not only my family as a member, but all families. United States Color Troops, the Busto men went to war after Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation. At least 14 of them joined the United States Color Troops, trained right here in Philadelphia at the William Penn Camp, sorry about that. This is just a representation of some of the men that join as the Color Troops, and this is a sign encouraging men of color to sign up and join the United States Color Troops. Over 15 of the Busto Moray men enlisted. The soldiers, as I said, trained at Camp William Penn, which was located just outside of Philadelphia. And this is a representation of the reenactors, the living historians, at the 125th celebration of Camp William Penn, September of 2013. My family has always been active in the Philadelphia area, and we have always collected art and collected documentation about the contributions our family made. And like many families of color, we have a family reunion. We just celebrated our 70th consecutive family reunion, first Sunday in July. I have a picture here of the earliest picture I could find of our family reunion, the one for 1912, and then 2018 was the 65th family reunion. So we celebrated, and as I said, first Sunday in July, we just celebrated our 70th. Graham's book can be found on Amazon, or you can send me an email at joycemosley.com. My website has the information. The book has won 2 book awards that I'm proud to say. So I just want to thank you for this opportunity to share my history, my family's history with a larger audience. Thank you for having me.
Be inspired. History is full of examples of Black excellence in every field. If she can do it, I can too highlights the achievements of women in Black Her Story. With rhymes and information, children of all ages can learn where we have been and where we are going. The book reminds and affirms what is possible. Yesterday to inspire what you do today, and tomorrow you can proudly say, look out world, I'm on my way. I'm ready to be the best that I can be as I look to Black Her Story, and as I walk into my destiny I realize that she is me. If she can, if she can do it, I can too. I know I can. If she can do it, I can too. I'm gonna make it and there isn't a doubt. There are no limits as I figure it out. And as I learn what life is all about, I'll be winning as I travel my route. No matter the storm, no matter the weather, from every goal to every endeavor. As I explore, I will never say never. To what I give, I live forever. If she can, if she can do it, I can too. I know I can. If she can do it, I can too. If she can, if she can do it, I can too. I know I can. If she can do it, I can too.
My name is Deshana Yamidi, and I am a new children's book author of a book that was published in February 2022 called If She Can Do It, I Can Too. It highlights 12 women in Black Her Story. That's what I'm calling it. And it's meant to read like one big affirmation for children. So, or adults. So there is a poem about the woman being featured. And then under her illustration, there is a small biography about her contribution to the world. The idea of the book came while I was earning a Black Studies certificate at the community college where I work. At the time, I was a coordinator of a Men of Color Student Success Program. So to encourage the students to take the certificate, I decided to take the classes with them. And one of our classes was African American history. In that class, our professor, she assigned a children's book project to the entire class to do individually. We could make our book about anything in Black history. So when I went home to sit down to think about what it was I wanted to write about, I knew I wanted to write about women. It just came to me. The title, If She Can Do It, I Can Too, also came to me. So this is my class project. As you can see, it was created in Microsoft Publisher. It's just folded paper. There's clip art there, and I can't draw. So that's why there's clip art. And on the inside are actual pictures of the women featured. Once I began learning what it would take to publish my book, I realized that there could be a licensing issue with using their photographs. So I found a wonderfully talented illustrator. Her name is Asia Middlebrooks, who was a graduating student from the college, the community college I worked for. She was actually editor of our school's newspaper. So she and I connected, and it was during the pandemic. So we got started late 2020. Asia and I didn't meet face to face until February 2022. We did all of our work together via Zoom and text messages. So everything worked out beautifully. To back up a little bit, once I wrote the class assignment and turned it in, our professor, she said, a lot of you should consider publishing your children's books. These are really, really good. I put my book into a folder and I didn't think about it for another 2 years. Right around the time the pandemic began, I would say it was maybe January 2020. I was in my office with my students and I pulled this out of the folder. And my student said, oh, what is that? And I'm like, that is my class assignment from African American history. It's a children's book. He said, can I have it? I said, sure. So he took it home, he read it to his daughter, and came back a few days later and encouraged me to publish it. So shortly after that, pandemic was declared. I was terrified. So I'm like, I need to make all my dreams come true. And being a published author was one of those dreams. So I sought the help of a local woman in my area who has her own publishing company. Her name is Valerie Lewis Coleman. And so she had a webinar that was designed to teach individuals how to self-publish. I took great notes, but when the time came, I still felt very green, if you will, very much a novice. I had never done this before. And so I hired Valerie to be my publisher. She edited the book, found Asia, everything came together beautifully. And it was in early February 2022, like I mentioned, that the book debuted on Amazon, as well as my personal website, which is ifshecandoit.me. It was a dream come true. there's really no other way for me to describe it or explain it. And the class project itself was not long enough. It was featuring 8 women. So when it came time to publish, I had to add 4 more. So I want to talk a little bit about who is featured and why. So first, I featured Madam C.J. Walker. And I wanted people to know that her idea for her hair care products came to her in a dream. I'm not sure how many people know that, but I think that's beautiful. Next, we featured Mary McLeod Bethune, who was, of course, the founder of Bethune-Cookman College, or what would later become Bethune-Cookman College. We featured Bessie Coleman. She was a stunt pilot. She became a pilot at a time where Black women couldn't fly, were forbidden to learn how to fly, so she had to leave the country to learn how to do that. We have Augusta Savage, world-renowned sculptor. And sadly, a lot of her work is no longer with us because it was destroyed, but immensely talented. We have Ella Jo Baker, who we can call the godmother of the civil rights movement. Wherever there was something going on, you best believe she was in the background. We have Dr. Mamie Fitz-Clark, who was part of the famous doll study, which was used in the case to desegregate schools. We have Fannie Lou Hamer, who we can consider a very staunch supporter of civil rights and voting rights in Mississippi. Katherine Johnson, who we remember from Hidden Figures. Just a brilliant woman. The brilliant Shirley Chisholm, all of her work in government and going on to be the first Black woman to run for president of the United States. Dr. Patricia Babb, a little known Black history fact, but one of my favorites because she was one of the first Black women in ophthalmology. And she literally traveled abroad and taught the blind or allowed the blind to see because there was no adequate eye care in those countries. Things that we here in America would be able to resolve very quickly, they didn't have access to. So she went and performed those minor surgeries, giving sight to the blind. Dr. Mae Jemison, who is a force. What can't Dr. Jemison do? And finally, we have Vice President Kamala Harris. When you look at the photographs of the composites of everyone who has been a vice president of these United States, you can't tell me that you don't have some pride if you're of African descent, that her face is featured there. So the whole point behind the book is to encourage children of all ages that if these women could do what they did under immense pressure, rejection, and everything that came with achieving their goals and dreams, what can you do? How can you contribute to the world? And how did they make your path smoother? The book is, again, available on Amazon.com, and it can also be found on ifshecandoit.me. It retails for $13.99. So that's what you would pay on Amazon. On my website, you would pay $13.99 plus tax and shipping, which is right around just under $20. And you get a better copy of the book from me because the pages are glossy, the paper is heavier. I would be absolutely honored if you would add this book to your home collection. whether for yourselves or for your children. The goal for me is to produce 3 more books so that there will be a total of 2 books to highlight Black women and 2 books to highlight Black men. So I am working on the book, If He Can Do It, I Can Too, which I hope to have published by February 2024. Again, my name is Deshana Yamini, and thank you so much for your support.
At the Table of Power, Food and Cuisine in the African American Struggle for Freedom, Justice, and Equality, published in 2022 by University of Pittsburgh Press, might be disturbing to you or make you uncomfortable. It is not a trip down memory lane nor memoir. There are aspects of America's culinary history, if presented honestly and correctly, that are not meant to comfort or appease you, particularly since the politics of these earlier eras affect and offer insight into the politics of today. Judge A. Leon Higginbotham and Harvard Law professor Derek Bell would have assuredly understood what I am talking about, especially since much of my approach to the subject has been inspired by their writings. At the Table of Power serves as a definitive corrective to the historical sanctioning of the denial of African American contributions to cooking and cuisine. It also answers the questions how and why the American culinary narrative has trivialized and denied the African American contribution, and what the implications are for correcting the current narrative in the future. Long ago, when the United States still considered cooking suitable only for society's bottom rung, the foundation of America's national cuisine was formulated in the pots and cauldrons of America's Southern Black cooks. However, the prevailing culinary historical accounts, or culinary master narratives, have not only erased the true contributions of African Americans to American cuisine, but also represent and reinforce culinary apartheid, That is, the theft of their creativity and contributions in American food and cooking by assigning Black culinary achievements to others and continuing to deliberately pigeonhole African American cuisine in the category of soul food, used as a type of cultural and culinary shackle. From the beginning, all Africans in America were presumed to be slaves, whether they were or not, and as such, anything created, produced, or conceived by Africans and their descendants, including their culinary contributions, was considered to be the property of whites. Slavery jurisprudence, that is, laws and legislation passed during the era of slavery, legitimizes culinary apartheid, supports and maintains white supremacy with regard to the history of cooking in America, and upholds now, as it did during slavery, the interrelationship between the American judicial system and institutionalized racism. In order to properly assemble and document the interrelationship between the current culinary master narrative and institutionalized racism, I consulted manuscripts, personal papers, diaries, menus, and other primary sources from 50 archives, oral history program, telephone, and other personal interviews, first-person accounts, U.S. House of Representative and U.S. Senate documents, court cases, court records, and U.S. Census reports. Laws and statutes were gathered, atlases and maps, brochures and pamphlets, catalogs, reports, convention proceedings, county records and city directories, newspapers and periodicals, and secondary sources, books and articles. Louisiana's culinary foundation is a focal point in Chapter 1. From the beginning, the struggle against culinary apartheid, with its settlement as a penal colony for the rejects and worst dregs of French society. The same racism that denies Africa its culinary due and saturates the pages of written history of Louisiana proliferates every other field where Blacks endeavored to make a living following the Civil War. In Chapter 2, Sustenance for Sustaining American Liberty, I thought that it would be fitting to take a look at, among other things, how George Washington circumvented the law to ensure uninterrupted culinary bliss by situating the capital of the United States in slaveholding territory. It was African folks cooking that determined the location of the capital of the United States. Caterers and restaurant owners, John and Nancy Riemann, dominate Chapter 3, Sustenance for Maintaining the Legality of Slavery, as does the culinary expertise of Ohio residents and former White House slaves of the Fawcett family. One Eastern Seaboard colony, referred to as the most complicit in the U.S. slave trade, is presented and examined in Chapter 4, Triangular Trading and the Colored Cooks of Rhode Island. The African culinary presence in Rhode Island established the culinary infrastructure, thoroughly enveloping that colony's magnificent mansions and homes, plantations, markets, steamboat travel, and hotels with a legacy of unparalleled cuisine. Throughout the 19th century, African caterers and restaurateurs such as Augustine, Dorsey, Stevens, Cromwell, Prosser, Minton, Price, Jones, Page, Trower, Shad, Dutrill, Bogle, and others made incomparable marks on dining tables in Philadelphia, making Philadelphia, without a doubt, America's dining capital. Chapter 5, Philadelphia, City of the Epicures, takes an in-depth look at these African men and women who are identified with some of the finest creations in the culinary arts. The fame of a number of these Black catering families was international, with their terrapin soups and stews winding up in London and Paris. Chapter 6, titled Them Pious Eats Tremendous, shines a spotlight on one of the Philadelphia caterers, Albert Eugene Dutril, whose two branches of his catering family were very famous, very sought after in the 19th century. But this chapter also shines light on the dinner parties hosted by the Catholic clergy of Philadelphia and how whites were more concerned with going to war against Africans over small, measly, menial jobs that Africans were able to get, rather than with what the clergy was doing with their parishioner dollars. Although Philadelphia was legendary as a center of gastronomic pleasures during and beyond the era of slavery, other East Coast enclaves boasted their own African culinary legends. In Chapter 7, Outcasts and Indigent Sons of Africa, New York's 19th century chefs, caterers, and restaurateurs, the invention of the potato chip by one African Native American chef, the sale of oysters by immensely capable Africans, and economically insecure whites who responded with violence to put down labor competition, are the focus of this chapter. Africans serving as cooks and fighting soldiers in the Civil War, and a creative Black chef and culinary artist by the name of Tunis Campbell, who was also a labor organizer and leading political figure during Reconstruction, are studied in Chapter 8, titled Running the Kitchen and Running for Office. Cheated out of his catering fees by the governor of Massachusetts, Joshua Bowen Smith, considered the prince of caterers of Massachusetts, and who also served in politics during Reconstruction, is another focal point. Chapter 9, Hoteliers, Dining Rooms, and Culinary Diplomacy in the Nation's Capital, tours the rich and influential, both nationally and internationally, who were drawn to the capital's stylishness and elegance provided in every venue by African quote unquote servants. Some of Washington's leading caterers and hoteliers were John Andrew Gray, William Andrew Slade, Samuel Proctor, and of course, James Wormley, whose hotel flourished during most of the years of Reconstruction. I would like to end by stating that African cultural retention and continuity permeate not only African Americans' culture, but white America's as well by virtue of the Black hand in virtually every aspect of American culture. However, the American culinary narrative still relegates the African American culinary contribution to peripheral status at best. Historically, African Americans have been defined out of their own culinary legacies and cultural expertise since arriving on these shores. The theft of Black culture was and still is an American tradition, a tradition that has been passed down just like recipes. My study shines light on a number of culinary artists who have satiated in every possible venue America's culinary experience with an examination of key Black contributors and their cuisines in the context of the times and societal obstacles as they established themselves in front of the stoves they encountered in kitchens across America and at the table of power. Thank you.